各位朋友，大家下午好！欢迎各位参加由 Mentoring 蒙科和组织隐形技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 联合主办的组织隐形技能管理系列讲座50场。今天是第23场，由来自澳大利亚的 Bruce Boyce 先生主讲。他今天将分别以小米、丰田以及波音公司的案例，然后跟我们探讨优秀管理者该如何学习隐性知识管理。首先，让我们来认识一下今天的演讲嘉宾 Bruce 先生。Bruce 先生他来自澳大利亚，那现在他其实人正好也在中国。他是一位知识管理专家，也是一位环境管理专家。在他曾经主导或者参与的多个项目里，他曾多次将知识管理和环境管理融合运用。比如，他曾通过敏捷和知识管理方法，监管了7740万美元的西西里河恢复项目。你还领导过澳大利亚56个自然资源管理区域组织的知识管理进程。他也率领开拓了多元利益相关者和多元知识的方法，来支持可持续的景观管理。此外，他还在我们国内的山西大学开设并教授了2门新的知识管理学科。他同时也是知识管理领域著名杂志 RealKM 的首席作家。同时，他自己也有创办了自己的咨询公司，他还为我们北京外国语大学的 CH 项目目前在授课。今天的讲座呢，我们主办方是 Mentoring 蒙科和组织隐形技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM。首先 ，Mentoring 蒙科是源自1981年，是企业导师技术和组织隐形技能管理的全球知名教育咨询品牌。Mentoring 总部是在比利时布鲁塞尔，我们在全球有将近600名的顾问，并且在41个国家和地区为跨国公司、国际组织以及政府机构等提供组织隐形技能萃取和企业导师传承相结合的培训和咨询服务。Mentoring 蒙科中国主要是专注在国内本土市场，然后开展这个企业导师制以及组织隐形技能管理的培训和咨询。我们同时也提供欧洲导师与教练协会 EMCC 认证的导师课程，是 EMCC 目前受证的中国唯一导师服务机构，也是国际职业导师协会 IPMA 在中国的独家授权合作伙伴。我们也是组织隐形技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 的理事单位。组织隐形技能管理全球智库 GO-TKM 是注册在比利时布鲁塞尔的非营利性国际智库。智库的成立主要是要为了推动组织隐形技能管理在全社会的运用，从而推动人类的高效率学习。那现在我们就把我们的舞台交给 Bruce 先生。Now let's warmly welcome Mr. Bruce Boyce.
Hi, I'm Bruce Boyce, and I'm very pleased to join all of you today to talk about what knowledge managers can learn about TKM from outside the KM field. In these first couple of slides, just a short CV. A key KM initiative I'm involved in is RealKM magazine, which promotes and supports evidence-based KM. This includes publishing articles related to tacit knowledge, so I would encourage everyone to check us out. Our web address is realkm.com. A snapshot here of my qualifications and experience, highlighting stakeholder engagement, complexity, systems and avionics experience, and from this tacit knowledge in regard to the things I'll be talking about in this presentation. And here, some of the manifestations of that knowledge, a range of the projects and activities that I've been involved in. From that short CV, you will have seen that much of my knowledge and experience in regard to KM has been gained outside the traditional KM field. That background has informed the topic of this particular presentation. Let's start with a look at who is KM's main focus. This is primarily organizations. For example, this can be seen in these very first sentences of 2 KM textbooks, Dalkia's Knowledge Management in Theory and Practice, and Uriart's Introduction to Knowledge Management. I've underlined the organizational focus in both. Also, I should mention at this point that there's a reference list at the end of this presentation corresponding to all of these references in brackets. As can be seen in this quotation, KM's organizational focus is also reflected in ISO 30401, the KM Standard Knowledge Management Systems requirements. My underlined highlighting has also been added here. So ISO 30401 sets requirements and provides guidelines for establishing, implementing, maintaining, reviewing and improving an effective management system for knowledge management in organizations. While ISO 30401 does recognize a wider interested party or stakeholder context to the organization's KM system, it sees the needs and expectations of those interested parties or stakeholders as being related to business and organizational performance rather than KM. I'll use 2 case studies now to highlight what I consider to be the dangerous folly of this approach. The first case study is Japanese automaker Toyota. From the very early days of KM, Toyota has been put forward as an example of good practice KM, with the Toyota Way encompassing principles and processes that facilitate the effective use of organizational knowledge, including tacit knowledge, in designing, making and delivering a high quality product. Highlighting Toyota's KM icon status, this particular paper was found to be the 10th most highly cited KM paper in a recent bibliometric review of KM research published over the past 30 years. And you can see the massive record of 1,933 citations in the bottom left of the screenshot. The reference for Centabelli and colleagues' bibliometric review can be found at the end of this presentation. However, the reverence for Toyota's KM practices has become seriously inappropriate. This is because Toyota's failure to effectively engage the tacit knowledge of interested parties or stakeholders in its KM system, which, as we've seen, ISO 30401 supports them in failing to do, has contributed to at least 89 deaths in the US alone from sudden unintended acceleration in Toyota vehicles. This unintended acceleration problem persisted for more than a decade, from 1999 to 2010, and instead of drawing on the tacit knowledge of customers to quickly and effectively resolve this problem, Toyota just ignored this stakeholder knowledge and played down the problem. In response, the US Department of Justice announced criminal charges against Toyota Motor Corporation. These resulted in Toyota agreeing in 2014 to pay a record $1.3 billion settlement for misleading American customers. As well as ignoring the tacit knowledge of customers, Toyota gave inaccurate information to customers and government and was heavily criticized for this by the US Attorney General. It also appears that investigators may have themselves inadequately considered tacit knowledge in regard to the actual causes of the unintended acceleration, highlighting the complexity of such issues. This particular aspect of the issue is further explored in a RealKM magazine article series, and there's a link to that series on the further reading slide at the end of this presentation. To summarize Toyota's knowledge failures, it ignored the tacit knowledge of customers and engaged in knowledge hiding to conceal the truth from customers. The definition of knowledge hiding given here is from the research literature. That definition is that knowledge hiding is the intentional act of hiding knowledge sought by others. So what was Toyota's response to being criticised for having ignored the tacit knowledge of its customers? Well, in testimony to a US House Committee hearing, Toyota CEO Akio Toyoda said what Toyota lacked was the customer perspective. He committed to devising a system in which customers' voices around the world would reach Toyota management in a timely manner. So did this actually happen? Well, as early as 2017, the Australian owners of some Toyota vehicles started reporting problems with faulty diesel particulate filters, or DPFs. After receiving numerous reports of these problems, Berrima Diesel, which is a repair garage located near Sydney, began to discuss the problems on their Facebook page. However, rather than respond to customers' voices as promised, Toyota's response was to threaten Berrima Diesel with a Supreme Court injunction. Automotive commentator John Cadogan takes Toyota to task on this behaviour.
A battle is brewing over the reliability status of Toyota's 2.8 litre diesel in Hilux, Fortuner and Prado. Some people say DPF failures in these vehicles are too common. Toyota, having invested billions in the perception of its reliability, recently let its lawyers off the chain, seemingly devoted to what I consider a grubby pursuit of shutting detractors up, which is never a good look in my view.
Subsequently, Bannister Law initiated a class action against Toyota on behalf of affected owners. The class action included the claim that Toyota Australia has engaged in conduct that was misleading or deceptive and, in the circumstances, unconscionable. This is hardly the responding to customers' voices behaviour that Toyota CEO Akio Toyoda had promised. The Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, or ACCC, which is a government body, also received complaints about Toyota's approach to consumers who were experiencing issues with the diesel particulate filters, and the ACCC launched an investigation. Toyota has since filed a court enforceable undertaking with the ACCC. Toyota has again acknowledged its failures and has again undertaken to improve its approach to handling customer concerns. So, to summarise Toyota's repeated knowledge failures, it has again ignored the tacit knowledge of customers and again engaged in knowledge hiding to conceal the truth. This time, aggressive knowledge hiding, as shown by their commencement of legal proceedings against people who raised concerns about the problems they were experiencing. That Toyota is continuing to be unable to effectively engage with customer tacit knowledge suggests that it lacks capability in this regard. A second case study, that of US aircraft maker Boeing, indicates that the KM field doesn't have the answers either, aligning with ISO 30401's approach to the needs and expectations of interested parties or stakeholders, as I highlighted earlier in this presentation. As with Toyota, Boeing has a much lauded KM program, as shown in the cover story of the October 2007 issue of the company's Frontiers magazine, and also referenced in KM community articles and media since that time. However, in October 2018, this particular Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX aircraft crashed into the Java Sea 30 minutes after takeoff, killing all 189 passengers and crew. It's the highest death toll of any accident or incident involving the very popular 737 series aircraft. Investigations found that the crash occurred because Boeing failed to transfer knowledge to pilots about a new system called Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS for short. MCAS addressed the risk of the aircraft stalling because of the 737 MAX engines being located in a different position to that of previous 737 aircraft. However, when a sensor failed, MCAS took over, pointing the nose of the aircraft down. Pilots could not overcome the MCAS dive because they didn't know MCAS existed. Contrary to Boeing's perspective, pilots believed that they should have been told about MCAS based on their tacit knowledge from years of experience. In the following video, angry American Airlines pilots confront Boeing in regard to being denied MCAS knowledge.
We flat out deserve to know what is on our airplanes.
I don't disagree.
These guys didn't even know the damn system was on the airplane, nor did anybody else.
I don't know that understanding this system would have changed the outcome of this. You know, 1 million pilots are going to maybe fly this airplane, and maybe one's going to see this ever. So we try not to overload the crews with information that's unnecessary, so they actually know the information that we believe is important.
We're the last line of defense to be in that smoking hole, and we need the knowledge.
We want to make sure we're fixing the right things.
Yeah, I get that.
And that's an important thing. We'll make sure we're fixing the right things, but we don't want to rush and do a crappy job of fixing the right things, but we also don't want to fix the wrong things.
Following the Lion Air crash, Boeing issued operational manual guidance. But, horrifically, there was then a second crash from the exact same cause. In March 2019, this particular Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX crashed after takeoff, killing all 157 people on board. Boeing 737 MAX aircraft worldwide were immediately grounded and investigations launched. The groundings were listed at the end of 2020 after requirements for rectification and improved pilot training were issued. As well as 346 deaths, the crashes, groundings and cancelled orders have cost Boeing an estimated $80 billion. The matter is also not yet over, with Boeing arraigned in the US federal court in January this year on criminal charges. In summary, Boeing chose not to transfer MCAS knowledge to pilots because of a belief that it would be knowledge overload. This is actually quite valid thinking by Boeing because there's a fine balance between providing too much and too little information to aircrew. This balance affects their situational awareness. There's more on situational awareness and the factors involved in it in the related article series in RealKM magazine, and a link to that series can be found on the further reading slide at the end of this presentation. However, regardless of that, if Boeing's KM strategy had required Boeing to include the tacit knowledge of customers in its decision making, then there could have been a very different outcome. This has been reinforced by retired Captain Sully Sullenberger, famous for safely landing a damaged US Airways jet on the Hudson River in New York in 2009. Sully stated to a congressional subcommittee that MCAS was fatally flawed and should never have been approved. He himself struggled to recover the 737 MAX in a flight simulation of the crashes, even though he knew what was going to happen. So, if the KM field isn't effectively addressing the KM needs and expectations of interested parties or stakeholders as part of organizational KM systems, Are there other fields that are? The first solution case study that I'll talk about, which is Xiaomi, shows that the answer is yes. Chinese electronics company Xiaomi manufactures and supports a range of consumer electronics, notably high-end smartphones and a range of smart home products. This particular picture shows a Xiaomi store in the Philippines, one of many both in China and also in a number of countries around the world. Xiaomi was founded in April 2010 in Beijing, and in the short time since, it has risen to be rated among one of the world's top 50 innovative enterprises. In August 2010, the company launched its first product, the smartphone operating system, MIUI, which broke the monopoly of iOS and Android. A significant contributor to Xiaomi's success is that, in contrast to Toyota and Boeing, Xiaomi actively and directly engages the tacit knowledge of customers through these online forums that you can see on this screenshot here. As well as the MIUI operating system and product-based forums, if you scroll down on this particular page on the internet, there are also country-based forums as well. As technology commentator Amy Karam discusses in this Google talk, rather than ignoring customer concerns, Xiaomi's forums welcome them and use them to develop near real-time updates of the MIUI operating system.
Okay, so Xiaomi, they have fans, right? They're not customers, they're called fans, and there's direct access to the fan base, and they tell them what's working with the phone. So, wow, they just shaved off millions of R&D because the actual users, end users, are telling them what they need to have improved. They have like real-time, like almost weekly software updates, right? So they're not waiting for the next, iPhone 6S to come out in 8 months with lineups around the corner, right? There's that regular updates, which is also, the Android platform that enables that. So they've adapted, they've taken innovation from all over.
But Xiaomi's customer knowledge engagement is happening as part of its open innovation approach rather than KM. Dr. Henry Chesbrough coined the term open innovation, and his models of open innovation have restructured R&D and created new landscapes of business development and innovation strategy. Two of his diagrams summarize open innovation. This first diagram here shows the traditional approach to innovation, where research informs development, which then leads to new products or services going to the market. So you can see the ARA research coming in on the left-hand side into the development funnel, and then on the right-hand side, new products and services coming out and going to market. In contrast, this second diagram shows the open innovation approach. Open innovation assumes that as companies look to advance their innovations, they can and should use not just internal ideas, but also external ideas, and not just internal paths to market, but also external ones. You can see these multiple pathways in the diagram. Although KM is not yet effectively engaging external knowledge in organizational KM systems, there are strong recommendations in the research literature that it should. In a recent systematic review of the research literature, Johann Schenk identified open innovation as one of 8 emerging innovative concepts in KM, and that open innovation is linked to another of the 8 emerging concepts, which is communities of practice. The link to a RealKM magazine summary article of Schenk's paper can be found on the further reading slide of this presentation. Open innovation through communities of practice is exactly what Xiaomi is doing with its forums. Xiaomi is also just one of a number of examples of successful tacit knowledge engagement in China, and there are links to RealKM magazine articles about other examples on the further reading slide of this presentation. The second solution case study that I'll discuss, the sustainable management of the Heldon Hills project, comes from my own work in environmental management. The Heldon Hills is a large area of natural forest located near the Australian city of Brisbane. It has high biodiversity values, including unique species that are found nowhere else on Earth. As well as this environmental significance, there are a range of competing and conflicting land uses, including sandstone mining and forest product harvesting. Management approaches to such areas typically involve government organisations imposing top-down strategies using their own internal knowledge, and these strategies often fail because they exclude the tacit knowledge of landholders and local communities. Instead, the approach I took as project coordinator of the sustainable management of the Heldon Hills project was one of what is called collaborative learning and governance in the environmental management literature, or decisions from deliberation and shared power in international development literature. This approach recognises that traditional organisation-centric KM doesn't work well in situations where there are multiple knowledges and multiple stakeholders. As this news article excerpt shows, collaborative learning can be messy, though, with conflicting viewpoints raised, and the resolution of these conflicts often requires lengthy facilitated processes of dialogue. Engaging everyone's tacit knowledge through a collaborative learning and governance approach resulted in a very high degree of support for the management strategy, as can be seen in the comments in the yellow box, which I'll give you a minute to read. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. I hope that it can help to encourage the KM community to look outside the KM field at how other fields are beneficially managing tacit knowledge, and to incorporate this knowledge into KM to support the strongest possible future for KM and TKM. These RealKM magazine articles relate to the topic and case studies of this presentation, so I suggested further reading. The list includes the article series with further information on Boeing and Toyota that I mentioned a number of times during the presentation. It also includes the Xiaomi and Heldon Hills case studies and 3 articles discussing other examples of effective stakeholder knowledge engagement in China. The next 3 slides is the reference list corresponding to the references given throughout the presentation. The further reading list and reference list will also be made available on RealKM magazine. Thank you again for joining this presentation.
Thank you for your wonderful sharing. Thank you for letting me know how we can learn about TKM from outside the KM field. And thank you for the fantastic case sharing, and thank you for the rich for the reading materials. Thank you very much. And now we are entering the Q&A time. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box or just unmute and ask questions. 非常感谢我们 Bruce 先生刚才的精彩演讲。那大家如果现在有问题的话，可以提问。那其他平台朋友可以把问题在其他平台可以直接把问题提出来，然后我们的工作人员会将问题然后反馈到我们的嘉宾，然后我们可以进行现场提问。Hi Bruce, we have questions from the audience on other platforms, and my colleagues will put them in the chat box. And first, Jordan shared his comments in the chat box.
Yeah, Jordan, I would very much agree with your comment where you say, I really think this highlights the need for engagement outside the inner circle, like engaging with retirees post-work life, keeping their skills to mentor the workforce. So yeah, absolutely. And not just retirees, but also broader society in general. So yeah, I would very much agree.
我们就是 Jordan 先生分享，就是说他认为就是这次的演讲，他也强调了一个我们需要就是知识管理以外领域的参与，就是相关的人员的参与。那比如说我们可以把这个，比如说知识管理，我们也可以运用到，比如说像退休人员，他们退休后的生活，就如何再继续充分利用他们的技能，然后来帮助到，比如说我们新进职场的这些新人。And Darius shares, thanks Bruce, in your analysis of the Boeing disasters, do you find evidence that Boeing had a lesson learned process?
No, their KM strategy doesn't specifically, or what I can find about their KM strategy doesn't specifically reference lessons learned. They've got quite a bit of promotional material that's publicly available about the strategy, but the strategy itself is an internal document. And no, I've been not able to find anything anywhere that says they have a lessons learned process.
第二个，我们的朋友他说，就是我在这个这场波音事故的这个分析当中，你有没有就是发现证据说波音它就是有一个就是说习得这个教训的过程？那答案是呢，其实是没有，因为波音它的整个知识管理，比如说它的这个知识管理战略，都是属于它内部的文件，并没有对外公开，所以也并没有什么蛛丝马迹的证据，然后证明他们可能在这过程当中经历了一个就是习得经验教训的一个过程。As Stuart also shared his opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite a serious thing to suggest that the KM team at Boeing weren't doing their job, but I think there's a broader issue for KM in general in that the Boeing KM team was simply doing what KM does and following the processes and practices that are common and popular in KM, and they very much look internally and insufficiently look externally. So I really think that this isn't about Boeing's KM team, but about KM in general. At the beginning of the presentation, I highlighted how the ISO 30401 only sees interested parties or stakeholders in terms of their particular views about business operations and perhaps the outcomes of the KM strategy. It doesn't see them as participants in the KM strategy, and that is a fundamental problem. So I think the KM team at Boeing was doing the best they could, but KM itself needs to be better reflecting the external knowledge situation, and needs to reflect that in ISO 30401, and to actually further the criticism of that, in RealKM there's an article, or 2 articles actually, where when ISO 30401 came out in draft form, it was heavily criticized for not sufficiently involving everyone within the KM field in its development. So I consider that KM has a real problem with stakeholder engagement and stakeholder knowledge engagement, and that's where the focus needs to be. In the wake of the Boeing situation, I haven't seen any discussion about how Boeing may or may not be reviewing its KM approach and trying to go broader. I would hope that they are. But to go to the other example of Toyota, the fact that they've repeated the same mistakes again, and this one's going to cost them even more. The court in Australia has found against Boeing in the legal action that's been taken, and it's estimated to cost Toyota $2 billion Australian dollars in compensation. So that's similar to the 1.3 billion that they paid in regard to the unintended acceleration disasters. So yeah, there's not learning happening there. Yet Toyota is praised for its lessons learned processes internally within its manufacturing plants. So again, this highlights what I think is a significant shortcoming and problem with KM that KM needs to be addressing.
那么第二个问题呢是说，就是您就是刚才关于这个波音的这个知识管理团队，然后他们没有做好这一点，然后让我有了一些思考。所以我认为我们在这个项目上其实已经做得挺好的了，但是有些人可能就很容易然后指出你在这个组织知识管理方面的一些不足。尽管我们其实已经有一些在这个知识管理方面已经做了一些预算，然后但是实际情况呢可能说不如预期。那如果我们如何对于这个知识管理能够更多的让它走向这个战略设计的层面，然后从战略层面来更多的去通过这个知识管理来支持整个组织的发展。其实我们Bruce 先生回答是，其实这个刚才我们分享的这个案例当中，比如说波音这个案例，它其实更多的可能并不是只是在于这个知识管理团队它做的好与不好，其实更多的我们要从知识管理这整个领域整个领域来看。比如说像 ISO 它当时提出这个知识管理标准的时候，因为当时我们就产生了异议，因为 ISO 它知识管理标准里面这个要求，它强调的是这个知识管理更多的以组织为核心，然后但却忽视了这个组织里我们还需要去在意的这个相关的利益相关方他们的这个需求和期望。比如说在案例里我们忽略了像客户的那些隐性知识，不管是波音还是丰田，他们都忽略了这个客户的隐性知识，他们这个都是非常重要的利益相关方的隐性知识在里面。那我们对于这个波音呢，它的这个知识管理团队，其实我也没有发现可能相关的讨论，说他们事后有没有对这个整个案例进行一个复盘，但我希望是如此。不管是波音和丰田，我们刚才看到了他们都遭遇了巨大的挫折，然后包括丰田它也因为这个在忽略了顾客的隐性知识管理上面，然后导致了它比如说在澳大利亚它当时面临了有20亿澳元的这个赔偿。比如说关于这个知识管理，我们更多的是要从我们整个知识管理这个领域出发，大家不仅要关系到这个组织的以组织为焦点，同时也要关心各个利益相关方所有人的需求和期望都要考虑在内。那以此呢，我们才能避免出现更多的像这种障碍或者事故。 Thank you for your answer. And hi, Bruce, and I have 2 questions from the Chinese audience. So I put it in the chat box. Its first is about the interested parties and stakeholders. Yes, the question is simple. It's about what do interested parties and stakeholders include in the organizational knowledge management?
Well, I think that was covered in the presentation, but what they include is they include the knowledge of the user or customer perspective. So in the case of Toyota, for example, the knowledge that external stakeholders could have brought had Toyota actually listened to them. In the first case, the case of the unintended acceleration, the specific knowledge was knowledge of a serious problem that was occurring with the vehicles that Toyota just chose to ignore and play down. And as a result, it was a problem that persisted for a decade. To contrast with Xiaomi, if there's a similar problem with the operating system on Xiaomi's phone, it's detected within a week and fixed in an update of the operating system. Not a 10-year delay of ignoring knowledge, but a 7-day of actually listening to that knowledge and incorporating it in the product design. So yeah, that's what they bring, is they bring that critical user perspective to the discussion. And in, for example, in the case of the work that I've done in the Hellerden Hills, the stakeholders there, many of them are landholders, and some of those landholders have had an active involvement in that particular land area for several generations. So their parents and then their grandparents owned the property that they now hold. So they have an intimate knowledge and awareness of the local environment. And often that intimate knowledge and local awareness can at least supplement the expert knowledge, or in many cases can actually be a greater level of knowledge than the experts. And when you bring those 2 spectrums of knowledge together, that stakeholder knowledge, that local, long-term local stakeholder knowledge, and the expert knowledge together in a collaborative learning processes, which is what I did and what I've done in other projects as well, you get an incredible amount of knowledge generation. Yeah, as I say, what they bring is they bring perspectives that you can't get internally, and they bring a richness of knowledge and understanding that, combined with the internal knowledge, leads to a much greater and more in-depth and more valuable and usable body of knowledge.
Thank you. 这个问题呢，是我们在就是布鲁斯先生在演讲里也经常提到一个，就是相关的就是利益方、利益相关方。那这些利益相关方到底它指的是哪些人？像我们刚才讲过的案例当中，那这些是利益相关方，我们涉及到的就是像我们比如说产品的用户，也是汽车的就是车主这些用户，包括我们飞行员，这些就是知识的从用户的角度，或者是就是消费者顾客的角度，是这些人就要涉及到这些人。那就像在刚才我们做丰田的案例当中，因为各种意外加速事故，然后导致了出现了很多的问题，那也是丰田它忽略了就是我们的很多车主他就是对这个意外加速他所具备的这个隐性知识。那就是小米它做的就特别的好，比如说它的这个操作系统出现问题了，那它可能花1周的时间进行测试，它就把这个问题解决了。不像丰田，它可能当时它这个事件它就拖了可能大概有10年的时间。所以就是小米做的很好的，就是我们及时的去倾听像就是我们的手机用户这样的利益相关者他们的及时的反馈，然后就是结合一方面我们是结合了这个专家的这个隐性知识，另一方面就是 我们可以结合其他的像用户这样的利益相关者的所具备的隐性知识，那这样两者相结合，其实能够更好的去帮我们去促进这个各方的合作，然后也能够就是通过这个内部和外部这个隐性知识的融合，能够让我们从更深的角度，然后来了解这个隐性知识，然后促进这个问题的浮现以及这个问题的解决。Thank you. And Darius, you raise your hands up. You have a question?
Hi, yes. Thanks, Bruce, for all this. I want to go back to Toyota, and you mentioned that some of the problems they had weren't raised within the organization. I used to live and work in Japan, and I was very fortunate to visit the huge place, Toyota City. And in Japan, they have an expression which translated into English means the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, which means that, you know, there's a more consensus towards harmony and less towards people putting up the hand up and raising a problem or criticizing the organization. And this happens in other cultures too. And that's why a lessons learned process, I mean, what you said about Boeing actually breaks my heart. You know, they might have a lessons learned process, but they're not learning the lessons. But I could talk about that for hours. But yes, so with regards to Toyota or other cultures around the world where it's more difficult for people, particularly in lower levels or on the shop floor in engineering, to raise their hand and say, no, this is a big problem. There needs to be some anonymous feedback process so that there is the opportunity for those who want to raise negative concerns. And even if they do, it needs to be in their HR policy that their job is not at risk if they decide to, you know, raise a concern. They should be able to do this in confidence. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in the case of both, well, certainly in the case of Toyota, I think its internal lessons learned approach works quite well. And if employees do have concerns, they are recognized and acted on. And I think it's quite appropriate to, you know, to consider seeing those aspects of Toyota's KM approach as being quite good. But where it's fallen down is on the external knowledge. So it's, you know, I think perhaps it's become so tied up in its Toyota way of focusing on its internal processes that it's become a bit of a groupthink situation, and that it really hasn't perhaps even, well, certainly the fact that it keeps repeating the same mistakes suggests that it's just not seeing the problem, let alone the solutions. So yeah, I think it has a major problem with external knowledge, and you know, the proof is in the pudding. Toyota, the year before last, slipped out of the top 10 of the auto rankings in the US, and it's other companies that are now occupying the top spots. And I think, you know, in KM, there's a tendency to keep focusing on Toyota, which was the icon 20 years ago, and quite appropriately. But, you know, where are the reviews of what Kia and Hyundai are doing? They're winning a lot of awards now. Where's the reviews of what GM SAIC are doing here in China? You know, their plant, their Yantai plant in 2020 won the top award for lowest number of defects. What are they doing in terms of things like lessons learned? I already know part of that answer, and it has to do with the effective use of AI and also human knowledge working together. So yeah, you know, KM needs to move from you know, recycling these old icons and actually looking at who the leaders are now, like Xiaomi, for example, like GM. You know, GM, go back 10, 15 years, and GM was a basket case. What did they do to turn things around to become the top now? they're winning the JD Power Awards in the US. What are they doing? And how can we learn from that? So, I think as much as these companies needing to learn lessons, KM does need to do that as well. It needs to be looking at who the leaders are and what they're doing right, and how that can inform modern approaches to KM. So yeah, and in the case of Boeing, I mean, there was collusion between Boeing's test pilot and the FAA, so there was actually corruption going on as well. So in terms of lessons learned, there's some pretty bad stuff that's gone on in Boeing, and look, to be honest, personally, when I make my flying choices these days, as someone who worked in avionics for a decade myself, I'm sort of taking these things into account when I make my flight choices, and I check what sort of aircraft I'm getting on. And there's certain aircraft I just don't get on. That's how bad I think the situation is with them. So.
这个问题呢也问得非常好，就是刚才这位观众，然后他提了一个问题，他的问题就是关于一些他的分享，就是刚才我们就是分享了个丰田案例，就包括的波音案例，就是在这个里面，其实我们也涉及到一个问题，比如说就是大家这个出现问题的时候，然后我们基于内部反馈的时候，比如说对于那些在组织内部，它可能它的级别它的比较低，然后可能对他而言，如果说是直接提出这个问题，可能说就是他的这个在组织内的这个地位而言，可能会就是比较的难。所以就是在有些组织里，它会有一个体系，就是说通过匿名的方式给予反馈，这个反馈是比较好的，因为这样呢，因为对于如果说员工他就是职位不那么高的员工，如果说直接对这些问题提出他的担忧的话，那他可能会对自身可能在这个公司，他可能会有一定的风险，对他而言也需要足够的自信。那这个就涉及到我们就是组织，它在一个是内部的。对于内部的一个内部知识的一个管理，以及还有一个外部知识的管理。那么在组织内部，我们形成一个良好的组织文化的时候，我们可以通过这个内部的，就是说大家这个经验教训习的这个管理机制，然后通过我们内部，就首先内部进行一个良好的一个隐性的知识管理。那对于外部的隐性知识管理，就是说我们刚才分享的案例当中，像丰田它有一个就是对外的一个丰田模式，但是它却屡屡出现了问题，这个问题长达10多年，而且一直当时没有得到解决。所以就是对于我们这个组织它的知识管理，它的一个内部知识管理以及外部知识管理，我们是值得我们就是深究的。像丰田这样的公司，它曾经是那么辉煌，但是在后来呢，我们也有越来越多的就是汽车制造商，然后在这个行业也占领了这个优先的地位。像还有其他的像 GM 也是我们就是值得研究的，他们也有非常好的案例，然后值得我们去研究。那我们作为知识管理的从业人员，其实我们可以去看，比如说在哪个行业，这个行业的领导者，谁是这个行业的领导者，那他们就是做了哪些的战略，以及遇到哪些问题，然后他们是如何解决问题的，我们以此然后来分析，得出一个他们的这一个隐性知识管理的方法。然后这个对我们而言是有非常大的这个借鉴价值和意义的。Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for great answers. And given the time, we will have the last question in the chat box from Sunshine.
Well, I guess to summarize what company or what we or companies can learn and do in regard to the case studies that I've presented is that knowledge management needs to involve not just internal knowledge of the organization, but it needs to involve the widest possible range of external knowledge as well. And that external knowledge needs to be treated with the same level of importance, or perhaps even higher level of importance in the case of environmental management, than the internal knowledge, because that's our clients, that's our customers, that's our users, telling us what is and isn't working with the products and services we're providing. And if we're not actively listening to and responding to that knowledge, then we're going to have plane crashes that kill hundreds of people. We're going to have unintended acceleration that causes hundreds of crashes. We're going to have massive lawsuits for defective vehicles. So yeah, it's a critical thing to do. So yeah, that's the lessons learned for or the lessons for companies. In terms of the lessons for the knowledge management community, us, it is that we need to look at KM's processes and approaches and ensure that they are facilitating this knowledge use as well. And that means moving on from those old case studies and actually looking at who are the leaders now and what they are doing. And it also means ensuring that we have things like ISO 30401 reflecting better the need for external knowledge to be part of the KM system. So in summary, that's what I would advise.
最后这个问题呢，我们也就是有一定的总结性意义，就是我们或者说企业如何能从刚才就是分享了这些隐性知识管理案例中，就是我们能学到什么的。就是总的来说呢，就是首先我们知识管理是要不仅一方面要注重这个组织的它的内部的这个组织知识，同时也要就是能够最大程度的去结合外部的知识。那这个外部的知识可能来自我们的消费者，来自我们的顾客。那这个外部的知识，它跟这个我们内部知识是有同样重要性，或者说甚至比内部知识更加重要的。因为我们就是不只是因为通过这种积极的我们聆听我们这个像客户、消费者的意见，然后并能够给予积极的回应，就像小米做的那样。这样呢，我们能够避免就是像丰田或者波音那样重蹈覆辙。那所以我们就是在知识管理最后呢，我们在知识管理方面，作为知识管理的从业人员，我们就可以就是看各行各业我们的各行各业的领导者那些优先的那个领先的组织有哪些，然后看看他是如何在做这个知识管理的，然后看看就是我们是除了我们聚焦知识 ISO 它注重的这个组织知识以外，我们又是如何从这个外部的知识又是如何能够去利用、去借鉴、去吸收，然后就融合进我们整个的组织管理体系当中。Thank you, Bruce. Thank you for your great answers, and also thank you to all the friends who have asking great questions. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, and yeah, thank you to everyone for your participation and listening. So yeah, and very happy to follow up with any of these things post discussion. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for taking your time and this afternoon. Thank you. And let me share my screen.那我们非常感谢各位朋友今天下午的参与。那我们也这里做一下下期的预告。下次的讲座预告是由 Sorry, and I need to put it in full screen. 我们下期的讲座嘉宾呢，也是来自澳大利亚的，是 Keith 先生，他是澳大利亚最大的电讯公司 Telstra 的前知识管理官，也是墨尔本知识管理领导力论坛的创始成员。他同时也是门萨顶级智商俱乐部的会员。他到时候呢也会来跟我们分享他眼中的隐性知识。那这次讲座是在下周一4月26号的下周一。那感兴趣参加的朋友可以就是扫右方的二维码，然后报名参加本次的讲座。最后我们跟大家分享一个 也是我们的一个重磅活动，是我们即将在今年的9月3号到5号，即将在瑞士的达沃斯举办第2届组织隐形技能管理论坛。那关于此次论坛的详细信息以及相关的门票信息，可以进入我们的官方网址 www.GO-TKM.org， 然后进一步了解。同时也可以扫右下方的2维码，然后加入我们的这个论坛报名意详情，然后可以进行进一步的交流。最后呢，我们非常感谢大家今天花时间参加我们的在线讲座。那我们也非常期望得到大家的反馈，然后大家可以扫这个右方的2维码，然后留下大家对本次讲座的意见，也帮助我们以后做得更好。好，今天的讲座就到这里，我们下期再见。